welcome to Learning Music with Pat. I want to do a little more work today on the identification of instruments. We may not spend all of our time doing that today, but I want to at least spend some time with it, because I notice that there are people that are still having problems knowing one instrument from another. And that's only natural if you have not learned instruments, if you've not been in an orchestra, if you have not taken music lessons. I know that when I was in the first grade, when I was really young, teachers used to come in, music teachers used to come in basically on a once-a-week basis or twice-a-week basis, and one of the things they did, and I was about 6 or 7 years old, I was in the first or second grade, they brought in pictures of instruments for us to learn how to identify them. They would show the pictures. This is a violin, this is a clarinet, this is a piano, and then they would have recordings of those instruments being played. So you could recognize an instrument by the sound and know it was a violin when you heard it, even if you didn't see the picture of the violin. And when you saw the picture of the violin, you were able to say, yes, this is a violin, or whatever instrument was being shown. Now, I don't know if they're still doing that in the schools today. They probably are. But it's still very difficult for some people to learn to identify instruments. I know I was talking to one of my doctors just the other day, and he said, Pat, unless you're involved with music, playing in an orchestra, taking lessons, then you don't have any idea what those instruments are. Now, he's an educated person, and he has raised a child who plays instruments, but he doesn't know the instruments one from the other, and he doesn't remember learning it in his school days. So I just thought, if he's having a problem and other people are having a problem, I want to spend a little time, especially with the saxophones and clarinets, because a lot of people play them, and those are my main instruments, although I play other instruments as well. So far, some of the mistakes that have been made, this instrument here, very beautiful. It is a bass recorder. It's called a folded bass because there is a curve, and that curve is a little bit like a saxophone curve. Let me just play a few notes for you on it. It's a very nice, very beautiful instrument. When I played it, there are people who identify it as a saxophone. The reason I identify it as a saxophone is the curve by the mouthpiece. Now, there are straight recorders, straight basses, and great basses that go straight up. They don't have that curve in it. But because this one has a curve in it, some people have identified it as a saxophone. It is not. It's a folded bass recorder. Here is, I'll take this one first. I brought in today both of my soprano saxophones. They're the smallest saxophones made. This is a curved soprano. Now, I was playing a solo on an alto saxophone, which looks just like it, but it's larger, of course, and somebody congratulated me on the solo and said, gee, it's nice that you can play a French horn like that. And I had to say, no, this is not a French horn, it's a saxophone. And they said, really? I thought it was a French horn. I don't know where they got the idea. The French horn is round, it has a lot of tubing in it, but this is a saxophone. You recognize it by the curves. But not all saxophones have curves, most do. You're dealing with the soprano saxophone. This is called a curved soprano saxophone. The altos have that similar curve by the neck piece and also by the bell. The B-flat tenor has it. The E-flat baritone has it. There's also a bass saxophone. They all have the curves. But the one kind of saxophone that does not curve is the straight soprano sax. So this is a curved soprano sax, plays all of the music that any saxophone will play, and a higher pitch, of course, very small and very cute. Let me take now. This is my straight soprano saxophone. It's pretty new, very nice instrument. It has no curves. It has the bell on the bottom, but nothing curves up, no curved neck piece. And also for this instrument, it's like a one-piece instrument. This one-piece instrument does not pull apart. You can't pull it apart with the neck piece and the bell and all of that. It's just one straight instrument, and I'll just give you a few little notes here. I haven't really warmed it up, but just so you can get a chance to see what they sound like. Very nice. A lot of people love them. And this one here plays the same way and sounds the same because it is also a soprano. So this one here, someone identified as being a clarinet because it was straight. And they said to me, and this is fairly recently, they said, "Oh, it's nice that you brought your clarinet in with you today." And I says, "It's not a clarinet, it's a saxophone." "Oh, really?" I thought it was a clarinet because it's straight. It doesn't have any curves. Most clarinets have curves. You take the alto, the soprano, curved sopranos, the altos, the tenor, the baritones, and the bass. They all have curves in them, but not the straight soprano. That's a straight instrument. Also, it's a lot easier to play than the curved. The curved soprano saxophone is notoriously difficult to play, very playable, but harder to do. I think the fact that it's so tiny, it has those curves on it, and it's just harder to play because of its size. And you have, I'll take next, the clarinet. So far, the clarinet has not been mistaken for anything else. It is a clarinet, and it is straight, and it is black. It does have a bell on it. Now, I want to show you a couple of differences between the straight and the soprano. Most saxophones and clarinets too have what's known as side keys. These are keys that are on the side of the instrument. There are 3 here, and you're going to play them with your index finger of your right hand. So you push it over, and you get those 3 keys. And then you have another 3 keys, well, actually 2 on this, no, 3. 1, 2, 3 on the upper left. And here again, you just move your hand and your index finger, and you play those 3, and they are responsible for playing certain notes. Now, the curved soprano saxophone does not have that many side keys. On the side here, it has 2. It does not have 3. And on the side here, it has 2. It does not have 3. We're not counting this. We're not counting this little one here. We're counting these 2. So this instrument is very old. I almost brought in the case, but I didn't. The instrument is so old that I don't know exactly what its age is, but you can tell that it's very old. For one thing, a modern instrument is going to have what looks like little ivory keys, or the pads where you put your fingers are all ivory looking. They're probably plastic made to look like ivory. The older instruments were ivory. You don't have that on this particular instrument. You put this down here. What you have looks like flattened metal. There's nothing ivory about here. Even in the back, usually it's an ivory-looking thumb rest in the back, and then you use this key from the thumb, you just move it up and use it. You do the same with the straight and all the other saxophones, you do the same, but usually you have an ivory-looking patch here, and this doesn't have it. And the case is very old, it's useless, I can't use it. Now the reason for the 2 keys instead of the 3, I can think of 2 possible reasons. It may possibly be that in the age that this was made, that they didn't have those 2 extra keys. You have to remember that instruments get redesigned every so often. It's just a process as they progress in the years. Somebody adds a key here or a pad there, and sometimes they just get a little bit different, and so they have more keys now than they did when in the past years when the instruments were older. The other thing to remember is that it is so tiny that it may well be that there's no room for an extra key or a couple of extra keys. At any rate, it plays any note that you would want to play, plays octaves, plays everything, and it's just really cute. So there are some differences in the instruments. Now I want to show you some pictures, some charts that I brought to show you the differences in the types of the loops that the instruments have, the tubing that the instruments have, and the bells that they have. The saxophone really has about 4 parts. You have the mouthpiece, which is a part in itself. The neck piece is this part right here. You wouldn't see that on the straight soprano, you'd see it on the curved soprano if I pulled it apart. This neck piece has a dip in it, and because of that, you know that this is a tenor saxophone, not an alto. The tenors are bigger, quite a bit bigger than the altos, have a much richer, deeper tone. So that's the neck piece. Then you have the body, and then it swings around in a curve, and this is the bell. The bell of saxophones are really quite large. Anything that flares out toward the end is a bell, and other instruments have it. A lot of brass instruments have it, as well as woodwinds. This is a tonette. This has a bell right on the bottom of it. See, it flares out. Let me just play a couple of notes on it so you'll see. I've played it before, but just so you'll remember. So there's a bell on this instrument. This is a song flute. It does not have a bell on it. It just comes to a close. But most instruments do have bells. Okay. And the clarinet has a little bell right here. Maybe I should pick this up. It's not as pronounced as a saxophone, but it flares out in the end, and that's a definite bell. If you look at some of the other instruments, here's a flutophone. It has a bell. This is a recorder-like instrument that does not have a bell. This is a penny whistle. It does not have a bell. Then you have the sassoto, does not have a bell. I have large sassotos and large penny whistles. They also do not have bells. No bell on that. Recorders have bells. They're small, but they do flare out a little in the end, so that is considered to be a bell. So some instruments have bells and some don't. In the brass instruments, most of the brass instruments have bells, but they don't all do. So this is a saxophone. I just drew this of the folded bass. If you hold it on the side, it has a little bit of a flare, so you might consider that a very, very small bell, but you might not too. On this one here, I guess I wouldn't consider that to be a bell, but it has some flaring on the end. And then it folds. That's the folded bass recorder. This is the bass recorder from the front where you can see the keys. The bass recorder is actually easier to play than the tenor recorder, because the tenor recorder, even though it's large, it's not as large as the bass, but there are no keys to it. The bass recorder and folded bass recorders have keys on them, and because of those keys, you don't have the enormous finger stretches that you do with some of the other instruments. This is an alto saxophone. The curve here, there's no dip in it. It just curves and goes up a tiny bit, mouthpiece, neck piece, body, and it swings around, and that's the bell. Now let me show you the comparative sizes of some of these saxophones. This is your alto. This is a tenor with a little dip in the neck piece. They're very quiet. They're really large. I have a tenor, and it's very large. It's almost hard to handle. It's so big. But it's nothing compared to the baritone that has the loop up here as part of its neck piece and mouthpiece mechanism. And look at the size of the bell. It goes above halfway. It's enormous. It's a very enormous instrument, and sometimes you see people standing up and playing them, but they're very, very heavy, take a lot of air, and as a result of that, a lot of people play them only when they're sitting down. Some people have stands that they have for them, and the instrument is hanging on the stand and being supported by the stand as the people are actually playing it. It just sits on the stand. Now, there is a saxophone that's even bigger. It's a bass, and the loop goes even higher. And you don't usually see them out in public because of their heaviness, unless they're on a stand and they're being led on by a stand, and a person sits down and plays. I know in parades, sometimes you'll have a stand set up. Someone will be pulling the stand, and a person will be playing the instrument as it is seated on the stand. Now, here's another, just for comparison, the E-flat baritone and the B-flat tenor. A big, big difference in the size. I wished I don't have a baritone, I don't have a bass, but it would be heavy to carry it. I want you to see this other picture of the baritone. I'm going to talk about the tubing. Why so much tubing in the larger instruments? But even trumpets and other instruments have tubes in them, and they loop around. I'm going to discuss that in a minute. There's a reason for it. All right, here's your clarinet. Usually B-flat clarinet. That's what most people play. But you can get A clarinets. I have one. And the A clarinet's used for concert work, and it's almost exactly the same size, but not exactly the same size. The A clarinet is just a little bit longer, but it has the same basic characteristics in the way that it's built, the same shape. When you get from a B-flat to an A, you have to increase the length of the tube to get that A in. And so the whole instrument is pitched a half a step down, and I can show you that on my keyboard, my little keyboard. Here is your B-flat. Here is your A. Oh, I'm sorry, whoops, let me try that again. I got the wrong one. Here's your B-flat right here. When you look at it upside down, here's your B-flat and your A. It's just one half step down, not much, but just enough. So you have to increase the length of the tube in order to get the A. The B-flat is just a half a step up. The A is a half a step down. And I mentioned that because it's enough difference so that you have to have a little added length in the tube. If you were to take and look at the clarinet, this is a B-flat. I do have an A. If I were to bring the A, and I will have it down here probably in a couple of weeks, if you were to look at them together, you wouldn't see a difference. If I'm to play both of them, you won't see a difference. It's just the fact that the instrument is a little bit longer, a little bit deeper tone if it's an A, but it has to have a little longer tube to do that. Now, we consider clarinets to be straight and black, but you can get some curved clarinets. This is an alto clarinet in the key of E-flat, and you have a little neck piece here, not as large as a saxophone, and the tube is quite long and the bell is smaller. So you would not want to interpret that to be a saxophone on the basis of the fact that it has curves. Yes, it does have curves, but the bell is smaller than the sax. The neck piece is smaller than the sax, and the instrument is pretty straight down. If you look at a saxophone, it's going to be narrow at the top, and it's gradually going to get wide down at the bottom. As the keys get larger, the instrument goes deeper. If you take a look at the straight soprano, it's quite narrow at the top right here, and it's quite wide at the end of it. And you don't get that with a clarinet. It's pretty much straight all the way down. And then another clarinet, which is even bigger than the alto. These are not size appropriate. I mean, in terms of relationship to each other, they're not accurate. But this is a very large instrument. This is the bass. It has a deep kind of a dip in the neck piece, which the alto does not have. It goes straight down, but for a longer space, and then it turns up for a little bit larger bell. But you would not confuse that with a saxophone. I can imagine that some people would confuse it, but it should never be confused with the saxophone. They are just not the same. Let me put this down here. Here's a trumpet. I brought it in for a purpose. I have said before that you have tubing, and I was interested in talking to you about the tubing. When you take a look at the trumpet, look at all of the tubing. There's quite a bit of it in the trumpet. French horns have an awful lot of it. The baritone saxophone has quite a bit of tubing toward the neck piece. You can see, as I've showed you before, it loops around. If you had a bass saxophone, this loop would go up here quite a bit further. What are all these loops for? Why all this extra tubing? Well, the reason is simple enough. If you have a tube, the type of tone you get from the tube, the depth of it, is dependent upon the length of the tube. The rule of thumb is the longer the tube, the deeper the tone. And so in order to have a deeper tone, you have to have a certain amount of tubing. The width has to be just right. And you don't want that tubing to be straight, because if it was straight, you'd have an instrument that would be so long you wouldn't even be able to reach the keys of it. So in order to be able to reach the keys of it, they loop it around and they make convolutions out of it. And the French horn, I don't have a picture of a French horn with me today, but it's very notable. All of this tubing gives the pitch of the instrument, and it doesn't matter whether it's straight or whether it's bent. The whole thing is, it's there. The length is there. If it's turned up into circles and loops, it doesn't matter. As long as you have the length of the tube as what it's supposed to be, you get the pitch that you want. And I wanted to show that in the trumpet. The longer the tube, the deeper the tone. If I take a little slide whistle, this is just a toy slide whistle. Let me get it started here. When I push it up, I shorten the tube. When I put it down, I lengthen the tube. As I lengthen the tube, the pitch goes deeper. Now, this isn't anything to write home about. It's just a toy. But you can see that is demonstrated. If I take this toy pan flute, this is just a toy pan flute. It's not anything really good, but that's a higher pitch because the tube is short. That's a deeper pitch because the tube is longer, and this varies in between. So there are various ways of demonstrating that the longer the tube, the deeper the pitch. And I have pictures here, I just brought them in, of the various wind instruments. A bell on the recorder, no bell on the penny whistle, a bell on the tonette, no bell. On the song flute, the flutophone has a bell. Recorder-like instruments do not have a bell. A lot of the instruments do have tubing and bells. The bells also increase, especially on a saxophone, the length of the tubing. When you consider, let me put this up again, if this were flat down, how much longer this instrument would be. It would be very, very long. You wouldn't be able to play it. It would have to be in a stationary position. You'd have to be standing in a certain position in order to reach the keys. So instead of extending it to the point where it can't be played, loop it around and make a bell out of it. And because it's wider at the top of the bell, it resonates and the tone comes out. So if you're having a problem in identifying instruments, you can always call me or email me, and I'll try to help you out with it. But it's important to understand what these instruments are, what they can do, so that you don't get mixed up, so you can just understand more about music and have a better musical experience. Well, I can see we're running out of time. So I'll close here, and next time I'm going to answer some more questions in terms of when an instrument gets so old it can't be played anymore, or should you buy a new instrument or an old instrument? Does it make any difference at all? What about professional instruments or student models? We'll discuss all of that next time. Please join me then.